I'm glad to see a big crowd. I know many of you, some of you I don't, and I figure some of you don't know me. I am the curator of the museum and all of that, but I'm Bob and Harriet's son. I think maybe that's the way I would like to start out about the thing. I grew up here and ended up going away to college and getting a job somewhere else, and as things go. And then in retirement, I've come back. In part, I think it's because I married Donna Shoemaker, and my my first wife, I think, always feared that I'd want to come back to Pleasant Hill, and so I think she would have worked against it, but Donna, being a fellow Pleasant Hillian, she encouraged it, and so together we got involved with the museum. Some of you know Bob Kennedy, who had been a longtime curator, has been blind for a while now, and so as a result of that, donated material started to pile up, and they needed somebody to start going through that stuff, and so that's what we've been trying to do for the last year or so now. Anyhow, so I guess by personal experience, I know a lot about Pleasant Hill from 1970 and before, and know a fair amount of it from the last 5 years, but there's a 50-year gap in between, and that's what I've been trying to fill in as I've been back here. I bugged my brother-in-law Butch there and for information, and he goes, "Well, I don't know." so I don't get too much out of that, but we're working on it. We'll get there eventually. I guess one other thing, just a personal story. My mother always used to tell me that I had deeper roots in Pleasant Hill than anybody else, and I never took it too seriously, and I don't know for sure if it's the truth or not, but she was a firm believer, and one, sort of trust one's mother, I guess, on these things. She told me that I had more grandparents, including great and great-great grandparents, buried in the Pleasant Hill Cemetery than anybody else. And maybe I don't know if that's true or not, but I did do a count later, and I found that I have 26 grandparents of one way or another buried there. So I do go back quite a ways in the thing, and as I get older, I think I'm more proud of that all the time. Well, I wanted to talk to you about Pleasant Hill. Victoria didn't give me too much guidance as to what exactly she wanted. I don't think she cared particularly. But it's kind of hard when you have the whole gamut available to you. So I think what I want to do today is talk to you primarily about the original Pleasant Hill that's on that first map there I handed out to you. That's out by the cemetery. And then the move of Pleasant Hill from that, what my grandparents used to call Old Town, to the new railroad-based town, Newtown, down where the museum is, down there. So, and then, I figure most of you have lived through the last stage of Pleasant Hill, which is going to move to the highway, which is ironic in a way, of course, because it's a move back to where the original Pleasant Hill was. So we've kind of come in a circle around there. So I'll get into that in just a second. I guess let me give you one little plug here. Come visit the museum if you haven't done that. It's a nice place down there. We have all kinds of records. I think the most used thing down there is we have a pretty complete set of high school yearbooks. And all kinds of people are coming there trying to find what their grandmother looked like when she was 18 and things like that. Have clippings files down there. So pretty much every family that's ever been in Pleasant Hill, you can go in these files and find everything that was in the newspapers going back to almost day one. We have the files of the Times down there. Connie generously donated those to the museum. So if you want to see what the original paper looked like in 1936 or whatever it is, you can do that. Plus the museum itself. So come down. We have quarterly meetings. Our next one is in October. So Donna has a few handouts about that. If anybody's interested in that or getting involved in that in any way, you'd be very welcome. Okay, about the town. I find that when most people think about a town that they live in, particularly if it's their hometown, they don't really think much about how the town came about. The town is just there, and it's always been there, and it looks like it does, and you accept that as you grow up in the thing, and you think not much more about it. If you do start to think maybe a little more about whatever town it is, Pleasant Hill in this case, you think, well, it probably has to do with those hardy ancestors, those pioneers that came in, didn't have much, worked really hard, and presto, over the years, we begin to get a town and begin to grow a little bit, and that's how it happened, hard work. Now, that's sometimes true, and in Pleasant Hill's case, I would say that's more or less true for the original town that's on that first map. And it's not true at all for the second part of the thing, the town down by the railroads. So I'll tell you a little bit about both halves. If you look at that first map, some of you may not even know about Old Town, but if you, let me get my map out in front of me here so I can see it. If that map is kind of obscure to you, if you look up in this corner, the upper left corner of the thing where it says Blackwell and Van Fleet, that is the cemetery. Back when this map came out, this is a 1912 map, the cemetery was only in the back half of today's cemetery, and these two people own land that was eventually bought by the Cemetery Association, and the cemetery expands eastward toward Highway 7. So that's Highway 7 that's running right down through the middle of this little plat here. And the original town is those 24 little plats. So it wasn't very big. Most of it is now gone. A few streets remain. That thing just says street. It used to say Main Street, which, by the way, kind of interestingly enough, because that was called Main Street, Highway 7, that's why when they built the second town down by the train station, that's why they couldn't use Main Street down there. So they had to come up with a different name, and they came up with First Street. So it's okay, but that's how that kind of weird thing happened. Our Main Street is First Street. I don't know if there's anything else about the old town. The old town had, by the time 1860, kind of the high point of the thing. It had 3 churches, so it got to be that big. It had 2 lodges. It had a girls' preparatory school. They were trying to get a boys' preparatory school, and the war troubles and border troubles came along just as they were raising the money for that, so I don't think that ever materialized in the thing. To me, one of the more interesting things about it is that about a quarter of the population was black, as near as we can tell. The black population is pretty much gone in Pleasant Hill today, but it was a sizable number even when I was a kid. But for a long, long time, I mean, there was 400, 300 African-American people in town, enough to have pretty much their own sub-community within the town. Okay, so that's I think probably enough about the old town. Now let's raise the same question about how a town gets started with the second version of Pleasant Hill. Now, I guess let me tell you how I got started thinking about this. Sometime or other when I was a kid, I started thinking about street names. So just like Independence and Lexington can lead you to some interesting kind of conclusions, I started wondering about all these street names as I was walking back and forth from the drugstore to my house and so forth. And you know all these streets if you grew up around here. There's Boardman, and there's Taylor, and there's Campbell, and there's Jeffries, and McKissick and Randolph, and I didn't worry so much about the trees the other way, except I always wondered what the hell a myrtle was when I was a kid. I never heard of a myrtle tree, but and then I started thinking, well, where did those names come from? Who the hell was this Campbell, and so forth? And so you start getting out an old history book. There's a couple of them. Those are Cass County histories that some of you may know of. And you don't find anything, hardly. You can find Armstrong. Armstrong was an old settler here. Turns out Armstrong is the guy that sold the land to the railroad company, so he was an insider and an outsider, I guess, and so he got a street named after. In fact, he got 2. If you look back at that old town, there's an Armstrong there too, so He made it in both versions of Pleasant Hill. But those other names are names that don't ever come up. They're not family names in the town at all. So who the hell were these people? And as you search that stuff out, you finally come to what I think is a very interesting story about how this town came about. Well, I guess let me tell you a couple of the names. Taylor, for example, is after a guy named George Taylor. George Taylor was president of what was then called the Pacific Railroad of Missouri, the Missouri Pacific, the main railroad through town. President of the railroad. Why would you name a street after him? Hall Street, very short street, but kind of an important street where City Hall was located, that little squib of a street down there from connecting the lake to First Street downtown. That was the maiden name of George Taylor's wife. And she was a St. Louis socialite from the Choteau family of very famous in early day Missouri history. McKissick was the name of the chief engineer, engineer meaning builder, of the Missouri Pacific Railroad at the time it came through. Randolph was McKissick's assistant. And so you begin to think that, gee, there's some kind of a pattern going on here. And it turns out that the key to it all is actually a street that has changed its name. We have a street called Lake Street that you may know. Lake Street didn't used to be Lake Street. Lake Street got its name when a man named Zenas Leonard built Lake Leonard. And Lake Leonard was hailed to be this thing that was going to make Pleasant Hill into a resort, kind of like Lake of the Ozarks, if you will. And the city got so excited about this, they decided they'd change the name because that was the street you got from the railroad out to this wondrous new lake that was being built. The original name of that street was Miller. So if you look at real old maps, that's Miller Street. And Miller is a guy named Edward Miller. And Edward Miller is the whole key to Pleasant Hill. At least that phase 2 of Pleasant Hill. All right, so that's sort of set the stage for this thing. Now, got to have a little bit background before we kind of come back to Edward Miller and this creation of the town by the railroad, as you probably can guess by now. All right, so I want to talk about the Missouri Pacific Railroad for just a minute here. Missouri Pacific is a railroad that was created by St. Louis business people. And they saw it as the way for them to continue their prosperity, which had started with river trade, as you probably know. And they were going to build a railroad to the West Coast, just like the slightly earlier Union Pacific that we've all heard about with the Golden Spike and all that kind of stuff. St. Louis didn't want to lose out to Chicago. Chicago had the Union Pacific. We wanted our own one here. So they started in 1851. They had a land grant. They had quite a bit of money. They thought they could do this thing pretty easily. But they weren't all that careful with their money. But more important than that, the border wars started happening. And they got as far as Jefferson City, and they essentially were running out of money and time, and the war was beginning to heat up, at least the unofficial war before the war. And they began to think, oh my God, how are we ever going to get even to Kansas City, let alone to get further than that? Now, it's an interesting kind of strategy here. The question that you would have if you were a St. Louis backer of this thing was, how exactly do you determine the path of this railroad? And there were two basic ideas, both of which made a certain amount of sense. One is you could follow the Missouri River, right? And by doing that, you would have an easy way to lay the tracks because it was a floodplain, right? So you didn't have to have all kinds of mountains you had to go over, anything like that. And second, the larger cities in the interior of Missouri were mostly at that time along the river, you know, the Lexingtons and all that kind of thing. And so that made a certain amount of sense. But on the other hand, those river towns were already being served by riverboats. And at that time, you know, the railroads were just a newcomer. They weren't as big and powerful as were the steamboat industry. And so the other strategy for a railroad would be to say, well, let's don't build along the river. Let's go overland. And let's tap some of these towns that didn't have access to the river. And those towns, they would embrace us. And more importantly, they might vote money, pass bond issues, and that could supplement these land grants that we had, and in fact, as it turns out, replace the land grants because they already blown all that money. So what the railroad actually did was to sort of halve the difference. And if you look at the path of the Missouri Pacific, from St. Louis to Jefferson City, it follows the path of the Missouri River. At Jefferson City, that's when the big money crisis happened. They said, I think we're going to change our orientation. And so the railroad leaves the river then, and the first big town that it comes to is Sedalia. And Sedalia really wanted them. Sedalia had a guy with some power, and he raised a lot of money. And so they said, sure, we'll come your way. And so then they kept playing that game. And eventually they come to Warrensburg, kind of following that same kind of a shot. They got a lot of money out of Johnson County because of that same kind of a way. So now quite a bit of time has evolved, but the railroad has got itself to Warrensburg. And so there's this last stretch. How do you get from Warrensburg to Kansas City? Now, I got to sort of play a little geometry with you up here. Try to imagine a line from Warrensburg to Kansas City. And, you know, if Warrensburg is here and Kansas City is there, it's a straight line, right? Easy enough. Passes through Lone Jack, more or less, and you're there. Pleasant Hill doesn't look in a very good position on that race. In order to go to Pleasant Hill, what you got to do is to regard that as the hypotenuse on a right triangle. And start back here with Warrensburg, and you come straight across, straight west. Pleasant Hill sits in that corner, and then you go almost straight north to get back to Kansas City. So what happens is that you think the railroad would take the easy path, but instead, as we know, the railroad took the stupid path. That is longer, indirect, seems like an idiot thing to do, but that's the whole key to Pleasant Hill. And so why did they do this seemingly dumb kind of a thing? And the answer is money, of course. And if they had taken that straight path, they found they couldn't get any money. That railroad, if it went that easy path, passes first through part of Johnson County. Johnson County wouldn't vote them any more money because Johnson County already had the railroad in Warrensburg. It passes through a corner of Lafayette County. Lafayette County wasn't interested in it because Lafayette County was controlled by Lexington, the county seat and the biggest town. They were Rivertown. They didn't give a damn about a railroad coming through the southern part of their county. And then the other county is Jackson County. And Jackson County didn't want to vote any money either because they knew the railroad was going to come to Kansas City one way or the other. And they didn't really care whether it came through Pleasant Hill or it came through Lone Jack. So they weren't going to get any money out of that thing. And so they said, we need money if we're going to do this thing. How else are we going to go? And so they approached the people in Pleasant Hill and said, boy, do we got a deal for you. You guys have been torn up there. You know, the Cole Younger burned half of your town. The Union folks came in, burned the other half of your town. There's nobody left here hardly, but we can save you. We can bring the railroad and prosperity to you very easily here. All you got to do is come up with, I forgot how much, $20,000 or something in a bond issue. This is 1857, by the way, when this happens. Well, it all sounds pretty good, and that bond issue is passed. And now, you got to, again, kind of pause and go back here to appreciate the story. This is all for you, Jeff. I'm all telling the stories here, the stuff behind the stuff. Think about it from the point of view of Cass County. We have an official Cass County representative here. So the county passes. It's not a city thing. It's a county bond issue. And you think at first, why would Cass County ever vote a big wad of money to help Pleasant Hill get a railroad? Harrisonville people could give a damn, They don't like Pleasant Hill, we don't like them, it's all the way back. It's that same kind of a thing. So why would Harrisonville people why would people in Freeman? Why would people anywhere? Except for the people in this corner, and we're the only people in this corner of the county. So you think, this is an impossible kind of a thing. And yet the county voted for it. Now, so, somebody wants something juicy to study, that would be it. And of course, there's not really good records back then. And there's two stories about it. One is that Pleasant Hill people were really good politicians. And this story is true. The Pleasant Hill people threatened, with the prospect of the railroad coming here, to say, we are going to secede from Cass County. We want to start a new county. They had a name for it. They called it Richland County. And they were going to take part of Lafayette and part, carve a little bit out of Jackson County, make Pleasant Hill the center of this county. And Pleasant Hill said, if you guys will help us pass this bond issue, we'll put this Richland County stuff on hold, and we won't pursue that. So maybe that's the reason for it. The other thing, there's an 1917 Cass County history that's pretty reputable by a Harrisonville attorney. And he says that what happened was not so much that Richland County stuff, but outright bribery. So the railroad came to Pleasant Hill for that reason. Now, so we're through one interesting part of this, but I think in many ways the most interesting part, query and subterfuge and everything, comes next. Now we come back to this guy, Edward Miller. And Miller was the chief engineer, designer of the track and the route and everything. So everything was sort of in his hands. Now, railroads at that time had fairly major towns they established about every 25 miles. They established sidings about every 6 miles, where farmers could come and load and that kind of stuff, and you get a little bit of water. So you had dinky little towns every 6 miles. Every other one of those would be a little bit bigger, but every 25 miles there would be a town that had a good many railroad services, and as a result would have the expectation of growing to 2,000, 3,000, maybe that kind of size. Well, if you look at those from Jefferson City westward, you can find a series of towns that are about 25 miles apart. There's California, Missouri is one of those. Tipton is another one of those. Sedalia, Warrensburg, and what is 25 miles or so west of Warrensburg, Pleasant Hill. And, then at 25 miles to Kansas City. So that was in the back of his mind, is that Pleasant Hill has a good chance to be big then. And so that was it. And then a second thing that going through Miller's mind at this time is that if you go back to my little thing here, and we have this kind of a deal, we have a position there of this Pleasant Hill where you could very nicely have a spur off of that railroad going to the south, serving our good friends in Harrisonville that we've been serving earlier on, and then on down to Butler and down to the mining areas around Joplin and all that kind of stuff. So, okay, now we have two things. We have this 25-mile location town, and we have a potential railroad junction town. And this is the last one and the biggest, I think, from Miller's mind. We also have a chance, if we play our cards right, to make a lot of money in a third way. Now, again, slight digression. I spent my life teaching in Kansas, so I know a fair amount about Kansas history that I've sort of forced to learn as a Missourian under duress, but they made the money. What you find in Kansas or Nebraska or South Dakota, all of those, is that almost all of the towns in the state were planned by the railroads, because in those places the railroads were the first thing. The railroads were there before there were settlers. So the railroads built out, and then the people came. And so the railroad said, I think I'll make a junction here. And I think, hey, friend, fellow employee of the railroad or fellow backer of the railroad, lend me a little money, and we'll work out a town site here. We'll control that town site. We'll run the railroad through it. We may even put a junction out of the thing, We're going to make a hell of a lot of money selling lots. We'll sell downtown business lots. We'll sell residential lots. We'll make a killing off of this. Now, see, that didn't happen much in Missouri because Missouri was settled primarily before the railroads, you see. But there would be an occasion, maybe, if you play your cards right, where you could get a town platted in the middle of nowhere, and therefore you could buy up the land and you could control all this. Miller had this idea. He said, okay, we got the money out of these things. We promised to go to Pleasant Hill. But you know, Pleasant Hill, and we're talking now during the time of the Civil War, Pleasant Hill, there's hardly anybody left. You know, we bombed the damn place out. Order number 11, they're all scattered every place. They may never come back, and they're clearly desperate. They're poor as church mice. They got nothing there, and I think they'll do pretty much whatever we want them to do. Now, the plan that the Pleasant Hill people thought was going to happen was the railroad would come up through Kingsville, through Strasburg, and then it would reach a place called Duncan's Branch, which you probably never heard of. Duncan's Branch is about halfway between Strasburg and maybe 2/3 of the way from Strasburg to Pleasant Hill. Where you may have heard about it is Duncan's Branch was dammed up to form Baldwin Lake. So that's it. So if you go down Country Club Drive to that low point, that's Duncan's Branch before you go back. So the railroad was going to follow up from Strasburg until it hit Duncan's Branch, and then it was going to follow Duncan's Branch and take a northwest tack, and that would lead it through Old Town Pleasant Hill, or just south of Old Town Pleasant Hill. And that was what was happening. But this guy Miller said, no, we're not going to do that. And Pleasant Hill people did not object. Essentially because they couldn't. There wasn't very many of them. They didn't have any money. They're desperate for anything. If the railroad came close, that was a hell of a lot better than the railroad not coming. So nobody squawked, is what it amounted to. And so the railroad got their land. Now look at this second map here for a minute. This one here, have this. First, look at the two little parcels there called railroad. Those are two 80-acre parcels that the railroad was given. And if you want to know why 1st Street and 2nd Street run at this odd angle, it's because of those position of those two rectangular railroad grants. And if you drove your railroad line and then your roads along that line at that angle, you got sort of maximum use of those two rectangles. You got 3 blocks or so of good commercial downtown area in which you could sell for big money. So that's why 1st Street and 2nd Street run at this odd angle. So they did that. They then Miller brought up this huge Becket area. And if you see this big Millers up there, that is this guy, Edward Miller, and that's the acreage that he controlled to form subdivisions, or residential areas within the thing. Now, Miller wasn't a stupid man at all. He ends up making lots of money. He does sort of let the locals in to some degree. So you'll see some other additions over here. Van Hoy and Meekin and Howard, Klein and Todd. Those are local people, and they laid out subdivisions. But if you know where those are, particularly Meekin's and Howard's, that's the gap. That's not the prime real estate for a residential area in the town. Van Hoy is a little bit better. Klein and Todd's is okay, but it's kind of a far piece, as you say, from the original destination. The good land is Miller's in there. So that's what happens on all of this stuff. Thing. Let me find here where I want to talk about next. Well, I guess that's kind of the main deals in here. They laid this thing out. Miller got control of this land, and he got his money to buy this land from all of these railroad cronies that I was telling you about before. A couple of names I didn't mention. Probably the most important one is Campbell, of Campbell Street. That's after a man named Robert Campbell, who was a wealthy St. Louis businessman. If you go to St. Louis, Robert Campbell's house, nice Victorian house, has been restored by the local people down there. You can tour it if you want to see what a 1870s house looks like. And he was the primary money guy behind all of this, so he got a main street named after him. Boardman was the head of the land office in Jefferson City, so he was an influential guy. They had the control, and he did it that way. I think I told you about most of the others. Those are the main ones. They thought when they had all this thing put together that they would be creating a new town. They thought Pleasant Hill was up there. They were going to create their railroad town down here. And so they came up with a name that they were going to name this town. And that's the town of Wyoming. And sometimes if you grow up around here, you occasionally hear about the mysterious town of Wyoming. It's actually a town that never existed. It was a town the railroad people were going to use as this town right by the depot there. But just before they got around to officially certifying this thing and filing the paperwork, the people in the original town of Pleasant Hill decided they would annex the whole area. So they did. And so, do you remember these old maps of the Pleasant Hill boundaries of the thing? It's this sort of weird shape, down like this with this big L. Mm-hmm. And it's shaped like that. Originally, Pleasant Hill was just a little square right around that old town. And then it just whoosh, right down here, not really caring about the middle part, but wanting to get that toe of that figure to get this area in there. So they annexed it, and the railroad people said, we don't care, we've got the land, we're going to make a lot of money. And so Wyoming essentially was still born, if you will. And the only remnant of it is Wyoming Street. One more tale. I got interested in it again. Hope you will. I think if anybody in Pleasant Hill ever thinks about Wyoming and had heard sort of this tale and wondered about where the name came from, your mind, of course, says, well, it must have been named after Wyoming Territory or Wyoming State. No, because this event is before Wyoming State and even before Wyoming Territory. That didn't exist. None of those existed. So you have to come up with a different thing. And it turns out there is a part of Pennsylvania, which is the home state of our man, Edward Miller, that is called Wyoming. Now, I don't maybe know Pennsylvania very well, but there's a coal mining area up in the northeast part where Wilkes-Barre and Scranton, where Joe Biden is from, if you remember Joe Biden, anybody? It seems like a long time ago. But that's called that big coal producing area up there where Scranton and Wilkes-Barre are. That's called Wyoming. That's called the Wyoming Valley, and that's where this guy Miller was from. So he essentially named the town after his home area back in Pennsylvania. So the name comes that way. I want to tell you here, and then take questions if you want to, is you turn over, or you look on that last page, which is just turning over the previous one. I did some calculations about was a lot of money made here or not. And I think it turns out the answer is some money was made, not a ton of money. Pleasant Hill did have a monopoly on trade to the west and south for about 3 years before Kansas City got itself established. And so there was a huge trade. There was trade about freighting goods to Fort Smith, Arkansas, Fort Gibson in Oklahoma. That's a long ways south and west. And all kinds of people made lots of money selling hardware and lumber and all those kind of things out of Pleasant Hill during those early days. One of those guys was a guy named John Nork, who's a great uncle of mine. So somehow or other, my family got in on a little bit of that money. That lasted only a little while, but still, that's nothing to sneeze about. The ranch line to the south was built, goes through Harrisonville, as you know, and as a result, for about 10 years, Pleasant Hill was a division point in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of railroad people were brought in as a result of that. A third result is that because of this railroad connections and all of this pretty good rail service to big cities, that really underlies the three big industries of Pleasant Hill historically. The Kellogg and the greenhouse, Booth and the hatchery, and the McDonald brothers and the scale foundry. They all used the railroad extensively, one way or another. To anticipate a little bit about what I'm going to talk about in October at the thing, I grew up kind of looking over Kellogg's Lake in the greenhouse out my kitchen window, so I've always thought about that. Have you ever been out Campbell Street? Go from Harper Street, you go down where the lakes are, and then back up toward the greenhouses. There was a hill of a fill there, and it must be 30, 40 feet of fill from Campbell Street down to Lake Leonard. That was all done by Kellogg, because Kellogg needed to get a lot of coal out to the greenhouse to keep that greenhouse going during the wintertime. And the way he got it was out Campbell Street. And he used to go way down and way up. And so he started taking all of the leavings from the burning of the coal and hauling those cinders back and dumping them there. So gradually that road got higher and higher. Kellogg's Lake got deeper and deeper, which is his water supply. So the railroad and Kellogg's you can see in that particular way. But you know, when I was a kid, Pleasant Hill used to be they called itself the friendly town of famous industries. And those three industries, tied to the railroad. Down at the bottom, the last little thing I'll say is I tried to do some calculations on some of the subdivisions that were laid out early on. And if you look at Van Hoy and Howard, they made a little bit of money, but not too much. But if you look at Miller, look at the amount of money that he paid for that land. He sold something like half of the lots by 1869, where my count ends. And he'd made about $34,000 in 1870 terms. That's a lot of money. So I'd say the town was a success as far as all these people were concerned. Not a huge bonanza, but a rather unusual town in many regards. So I think that's the end of what I need to say here right now. We'll sometime talk later about the highway and all of that. But if you've got it, very welcome to ask them. We can talk as a group or individually, however you want to do it. Hello, Mark.
When did the Norps come into the area?
The Norps, like a lot of people, came in right as soon as the railroad was here. They knew it was coming. It was sort of forecast for a long time. You know, they made this deal, but it took from, I told you, the 1857 is when they passed this bond issue. The railroad doesn't get here till 1865. So there's all this sort of, is it coming, and the Norps were from down around St. Louis. He passed through here trying to go to the gold rush in Colorado and passed through the area, kind of liked it, heard rumors of the railroad, and when the railroad came, he came back, and he got in on the ground floor.
So this would have been your great-great-grandfather?
Well, it's not, it's an uncle.
Uncle.
Yeah, it's not a direct line. I come from the poor Norps, not the rich Norps. Yeah.
Pete, in all your research, especially as it related to the railroad moving down there, as I recall, many years ago, there was quite a livestock holding area down there on the southeast end of town.
Yes, it moved around a few places. I don't think it was ever
Was
huge.
it significant, or
I don't think so. I thought it might be, and I chased it, and you can't find very much about it.
There are still some remnants of that on River Farm.
Are there? Good. I'm glad there are. Like what?
Just old hedge posts and things where they had some holding pins, and it's kind of melted down. There used to be quite a bit.
I just don't think it took very long, Gil, before they started shipping them on the train to Kansas City. So I
got
found
the impression it was kind of a holding pen for cattle, that would come in, be driven into these holding areas and then shipped out on the rail, because that was a rail to the south and a rail to the east and a rail to the west.
It's south of 58 where they were down where the Y is.
You can find them.
But not far from
I found them in different places. So I think either different railroads had them. I think the Rock Island built one later on their line.
This is north of Rock Island.
Yeah.
Where they were at.
Could be. There's a book by Norma Rouse Middleton. I don't know whether you've seen that about
Okay.
Pleasant Hill. And there's a memories section of that in the end. And I forgot who it is, but there's a woman that was growing up on Webster Street, and she's talking about when she was a girl, like 1905, something like that. She recalls people knocking on the doors and saying, "Everybody get in." And there would be a herd of cattle that would be driven down Webster Street to some holding pens that were on the railroad. And if you look at some of the old maps, at the end of Webster Street, there's a street that goes off that's called Stockyard Street. It goes down to, but I never found out much about it. There's two things that were down there. There's stockyards, one or two or several places, and there were canning factories that were down there that existed for a while and then seemed to have disappeared. And with all the floods and all this kind of stuff, it's kind of hard to find too much remnants of that. As far as I know, nobody's ever really looked either.
When did the poultry farm, or the poultry,
Booth came here, I think it's 1926, about that time. He was from Clinton, so he wasn't from very far away. And his brother started an outfit in Clinton. Then his brother went to World War I, and Booth, the younger brother, was called upon to take over the industry, and he got really good at it. His brother came back, and so Booth was forced to go somewhere else. So he didn't have to compete with his brother. And he scouted around and said, there's a quote from him that says he found a lot of people in this area that were interested in poultry breeding. And so he thought that was a good place to be. Because, a hatchery back then didn't do their own stuff. They had to rely on farmers bringing the eggs to them. So they needed farmers that were interested in this kind of stuff that would have as high a quality of chickens as you could. And then gradually the hatcheries took over the making of their own.
I knew about Pleasant Hill before I ever moved here because my mother would come down here and get baby chicks.
Yeah.
And I said, I moved to a town that knew how to pronounce and spell my maiden name. My maiden name is Shishing.
Oh,
And so, Minnie Shishing, my mother came down to get baby chicks. She didn't have to spell her name or pronounce it. Because Minnie knew how to spell it. So, anyway, we got baby chicks down here for all the years.
just
That's why we're the roosters and chicks. People say, where are roosters and chicks? That's
people forget this stuff. I have a story that I can't tell you the name of this person, but she had lived here 30 years, and at the time I was writing about Booth and the hatchery in the town, and so I thought, well, I'm kind of curious about what sort of general folk knowledge there is around about. So I said, do you know how the roosters got their name? He said, yeah, well, it's old. She said, I think I heard that the high school was built on the foundations of a hatchery that burned down a long time ago. And I thought, boy, that's a classic story, You have this dilemma, you want to know where it comes from, and so you sort of, a folk story sort of emerges about a burned down hatchery.
The hatchery was out with Tallgrass, where Tallgrass is now, right?
Well, yes and no. That was where the experimental farm was.
Okay.
That's not where the hatchery was downtown.
Right next to the post office.
This is post office.
Well, want another story real quick?
Wait, you don't tell how the story roosters really.
No, I don't want to tell that. To me, a better story is this one, and that is that I think probably the most impressive building in Pleasant Hills, even today, is the post office. It's a really nice building, and it is just extraordinary for a town as small as this, especially back then when that building, to have one that big. And the reason that we have this really nice post office is because we had incredible volume of mail going out of here. And the reason we had incredible volume was Booth mailing these baby chicks out all over the country. The world's, as you say, largest producer of baby chicks. I mean, it's really amazing. That's amazing. And then you put that with two other things. World's largest producer of baby chicks, largest greenhouse west of the Mississippi, and the one and only manufacturer of large heavy-duty scales for the entire country, had a patent on this pitless scale. I mean, a town of hardly anybody living in it, and 3 world-class industries. It just boggles the mind to me. I just can't. I took it for granted growing up, but as I get away from the thing, I just can't believe it.
Did we have a garment factory as well down here?
Yes, but that's really small potatoes compared to all of this. That was
I think
that was a Kansas City firm looking for cheap labor, essentially.
Can you tell us where the rooster came from, though? Did it come from the hatchery?
Yes, yeah. Booth gave the money for the uniforms, for the first uniforms. I think I read they were called pioneers, where the high school team was for the first year or two, and Booth gave the money. And then, I think it's really appropriate that we are the roosters. Better than being named carnations, I guess.
I can remember, and maybe some of the rest of the, going into the post office as a little boy, and I mean, you couldn't hear yourself. There was so much cheeping and chirping going on. I mean, it was a drone.
Booth was one of the first ones to discover that you could ship these chicks, and they could take it for 3 days or however long it took you to get 3/4 of the way across the country, or whatever his range was. And Booth always said, you don't have to do anything really innovative. You just have to do what you do just a little bit better. And he exploited that, just like Kellogg. Kellogg exploited the telephone. He was there at day one of the telephone, and he was able to supply all these little florist shops that had a big wedding and didn't have enough flowers, and he could get them there overnight, And so, wham, the thing got big just because of the telephone.
History of the banking, the banking.
Pleasant Hill Bank.
Bank, how that all got started with Gothard.
No, I don't know a great deal about it. I mean, the Pleasant Hill Banking Company is what the original one there goes. It goes back to the 1870s in town. That is an old bank. There were lots of others that either went out of business or were absorbed. To get back to the Norps, my family, my mother's family, they started a bank called the Citizens Bank, which you can still see Citizens, above the one thing downtown. They probably were absorbed by the Pleasant Hill Bank. But there were lots of other banks. All these towns had a bunch of little banks, and they folded. In the 1910s, I think Pleasant Hill had 4 different banks. Gradually collapsed down there. What's that?
The Gothards were fairly late.
Yes.
Like 70s or something.
Yeah, pretty much. I can't remember whether they. I graduated from high school in 1962, but I'm trying to remember whether the Gothards were there. I think maybe they were not. Maybe. Do you know whether Donna, were they Gothards here when you were?
I don't know.
Sometime circa 60 or 70s when the Gothards came in and brought it out. I kind of resent that they don't call it the Pleasant Hill Bank anymore myself.
Yeah.
But yeah,
So Pete, you might want to think about doing a follow-up.
a follow-up.
Yes. So you started with the railroad coming in with the bonds, and the domino effect of that led to one of the biggest scandals in the nation
Yeah,
at that time.
lots of scandals.
Yes. So it would be intriguing.
I have never studied that, and I don't.
Uh-huh.
Have you ever found anybody that's ever studied it well?
I mean,
Just a little
we've
bit.
done a little bit. I have a little presentation on it, but nothing in depth.
It, I'm sure deserves lots of stuff.
It's fascinating. And it's got the Gun City Massacre, if anybody's familiar with that.
I used to live in a farm where the railroad went through.
So,
I'm happy to talk all day, but I don't want to keep you. Maybe we can sort of abandon officially, and anybody wants to stay and talk. That's be be great as far as I'm concerned.
We have some books back there.